Our next speaker is going to be Mark Hale. Mark is the Deputy Program Manager of the Wildland Fire Research Development and Application Team for the Forest Service. He manages projects such as WFDS, the Wildland Fire Decision Support System, and other research development and application projects. Mark is a qualified FBAN, LTAN, and SOPL, and routinely assists the field with decision support and fire behavior modeling. Let's get the presenter role transition to Mark. Thanks, Wes, and thanks for joining us, Mark.
So Wes had asked me to talk about National Decision Support Center that we set up this year. And hold on a minute, I got a cat that likes to jump on my desk. We set this up this year. It's the first time it had been done. And there's been other decision support centers set up over time, but they've been more regional. So this is the first time we've done this. Let me flip to the next slide. So kind of some things I'm going to go over is just a brief introduction to decision support centers, kind of what is it, a bit of history, organization, potential products, talk a little bit about the National Decision Support Organization setup, acquiring resources, some of the things we ran into, products produced, lessons learned, pros and cons. And then we'll look at some stats, and it's a little mixed with some of the stuff from Northern Rockies. We weren't able to completely separate it out, but you'll kind of see there was quite a bit that was done between Northern Rockies and the National Decision Support. I managed and worked with both of those with Alan Hepworth. So what is Decision Support Center? Some of you have worked at them, know exactly what they are, but they kind of vary. It depends on what the needs are. In general, the center created to share resources, provide intel products for MAC groups, operational groups, SCACs, incidents, allows for groups, they're pods of groups. So in some cases, you may have roving bands that are working for a decision support center. In the past, those decision support centers were usually set up at a GAC. And so you have kind of a hub, and then you might have people running around out there, roving around. Some of the things is it provides for better information sharing among analysts, and in many cases, development of SOPs for fire modeling. So you get a group of smart people together, come into these organizations, and then they can help with understanding what's going on the ground and help with rule sets for landscapes and things like that. Normally, they're established when you have a high need, usually higher planning levels, extreme conditions. And the concept, I don't think it's completely new. I think it's been going on in various ways or in various areas over time. Within the last 10 or so years, 15 years, with the advent of WFDS, there was a lot of tech transfer that went on and learning how to use the model. So that was something in the 2000s, like 2010 on, where there was a lot of decision support. And then as people became more familiar with the models, there was a little less, but occasionally those will pop up in certain regions and use them. Lack of better terms, hit squad for activity when it ramps up. As far as decision support organization, that can vary, depends how the GAC wants to run those or who's operating those. But generally, it has a decision support lead. That can be an LTAN, a SOPL, and FBAN, and they usually supervise LTANs, SOPLs, and FBANs. Also, sometimes there'll be technical specialists, GIS people. In some cases where I've been involved, you'll have a lead LTAN or a lead SOPL to kind of help with distribute some of the workload. And so that seems to help. The THSPs and GIS folks, sometimes we'll have some of those, and they'll be part of the organization to support briefings and create products. And occasionally, smoke air resource advisors may be part of the organization. In 2017, for example, just to get kind of an idea, we had a DSC there. We had, I think, 8 or 9 LTANs, a couple FBANs, 3 or 4 SOPLs, and 6 smoke people. And those smoke people worked with our modelers because they were able to use some of the information that they had. So some of the products usually produced. You may have regional and instance specific analysis, long-term analysis, fire timelines, decision support, strategic and MAP documentation support, AGOL products for long-term plans, decisions, smoke documentation. I know when the smoke group we had, they were able to actually set up AGOL products, hand out the website, and it was a way to go to a meeting, pass information on, and it was pretty slick, worked pretty good. And then additionally, when those groups are usually set up, if there's lulls, there's a lot of talent there, and so you might work on other things for the region while you're sitting there. Generally, provide briefings is another thing for MAC groups, GACs. We've done GAC briefings, MAC group briefings, public meetings, strategic meetings. In 2017, we actually did one where we briefed the chief, or not the chief, but the two secretaries for DOI and FS. Also, especially with the FBANs, if you wonder how those are used, a lot of times those are used to kind of fill in between gaps with people. So that's something that these positions can do, kind of just, hey, we need a position for a team, or we need an LTAN for 2 days. And so the decision support sometimes will loan folks out that way. And then why National Decision Support Center? So in 2021, we started to see a shortage of personnel, whether it was COVID, it was travel restrictions. There's been shortages with trainings. 495 is a good example with, that's been a challenge to get that course out. And so there just was a shortage of folks that they were seeing, especially as a season one FBANs was one that became critical, trying to find people to fill that position. Part of that, was the teams that were going out. They also had shortages. So a lot of those same folks that had LTAN and or FBAN were filling other roles on teams. Another reason that kind of came up was when the Northern Rockies Decision Support was set up, we started to bring in people. So there was also concern that if we had limited resources, and then we had everybody kegged up that was available to do LTAN and so forth, that then they wouldn't be available for the other regions. So the National Decision Support concept kind of came to be to kind of help allow some flexibility to prioritize folks, kind of like they do with IMTs and some hotshot crews, just to be able to greater sharing of the resource. So. All right, so organization set up. So once we had some calls with some of the GA editors and some different folks that came forward and said, hey, we're concerned about this. We're worried that if we're going to run out of folks, and what are we going to do? And then also, hey, how do we share? So we started kind of working with Region 4 a little bit, and we got on some calls, and that's where the concept of, hey, let's do this National Decision Support. So Tim Sexton, my boss, worked with NMAC, and they created a memo on July 21st that kind of supported the concept, and then also kind of gave us the authority to kind of work with Nick to use the large fire support code for resources. Acquiring resources, so there was a combination of things. I had already worked with the Northern Rockies Decision Support, plus I know quite a few people with just some of my interactions. So, it was, who do I know? And then one of the bigger parts was we started calls on the 24th of July with GAC representatives that we could get on. And they did a lot of sharing, and that was a big part of it. So we acquired mostly through sharing on calls. They would say, I have a person who's available, but they can't travel. Or I have a person who's available part-time, or hey, I know of a trainee who's an AD. So that's where we ended up getting these resources. And a lot of those resources were not showing up on in Iraq or, so, it was easy to kind of find them that way because people knew they were hidden and buried at. So, It was a combination of, we used LTANs, FBANs, SOPLs, and THSPs were utilized. We had some people with COVID and different things pack tested that were qualified folks, and we were able to utilize their knowledge on incidents and then work with qualified folks. We had that covered. Resources were mostly virtual, but some were on site, and worked, a lot of them worked multiple fires. And then all orders were placed to Nick by the DSC lead, which in this case, I was kind of the primary, and Tim backed me up on most of this. Many of the products, some were new, some were not. So, we provided fire behavior modeling for both incidents. We worked with Rick on RMA, when he needed support. We worked with him to help there. Long-term assessments, we did, we helped with one with the Pacific Northwest. We looked at some stuff for North Ops, and they had a lot of the information, so we never quite got to how we would help them with that. We also did a number that were for incidents. They were like, hey, we need a long-term plan. We're going to have a public meeting. We got to have some information. So we were able to have analysts do that. Virtual and in-person briefings for agency administrators, cooperative design IMPs. We had folks who were on site. So we had some folks that could travel, and then we would try to get them to the areas that they were most needed. The decision support, we help with decisions, timelines, map booklets, or decision synopsis, just, those kind of products. Somebody, hey, I need a quick look of something. Strategic plans support. We worked on stuff with Dixie and Caldor, and Wes worked on those things. We did presentations virtually, in person, AGL story maps, a lot of different things for decision support. That was usually mostly the SOPLs and some of the other folks. Virtual FBAN support to fill gaps. Normally that's not something you would think of as a virtual FBAN, but we had a lot of trouble. A lot of people were having trouble rostering FBANs, and we had FBANs, but they couldn't travel. And so you kind of had to research the background of the folks and experience, but we were able to provide FBANs to cover gaps between teams or until someone showed up. And in some cases, those same people ended up being on the teams that went to the fires, so they were already dialed in. Experimental products, like I say, there's a long-term strategic plan that Wes and Jim Meridian worked on. Tim Sexton headed that up. That was was done mostly for Caldor and Dixie fires, I believe. We provided personnel to establish a DSC for North and South Ops. So North Ops had wanted to set one up for many years and hadn't had the opportunity, or just things didn't work out. So we worked with Billy Gardino to set one up, and it was staffed by folks from the National Decision Support. And we had the lead, Alan Hepworth, who went there and kind of orchestrated behind the scenes. And he wasn't at the GAC, but he was able to orchestrate and make sure things were moving. And we had a few people that were on site and a lot of them that were virtual. Team use, channels set up for the GACs. We worked with the FireNet group to set up a team. And then as things evolved for Northern Rockies, and as things evolved, we set one up for National Decision Support, and just trying to figure that out. So we had some THSPs that we brought in that you wouldn't normally think for DSC. They were organizers, for lack of a better term. They helped figure these things out, set up the products. The GACs, when I've looked at things over time, it's like, who's got SOPs? And it was hard to find those. Where were they at? Who originally did them? So we set up these channels, and basing what we learned in Northern Rockies, try to set up some products that could be put in there and kind of a break glass and utilize those things as you need to. And then it also, each GAC would have a channel that they could go in when they have fires and then just do their chats and different things. Those people also helped a lot with our meeting setup and organization there. Let's see. And the other one was NMAC updates. And then I was submitting weekly updates to Kim Christensen on where we were at. They were kind of basic, but at least she knew how many people who were ordered. And also when we did orders, she was included in every order. And she was there to kind of help as a liaison if we needed help getting that stuff going. So some pros and cons. We were able to cover more ground and maximize analyst time and skills. We had one overarching management code that eliminated the need to create resource orders or do reassignments. And it was huge because I could say, hey, Ian, you need this person for some fires. Yep. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to move them to Northern California. And I didn't have to do a bunch of things. I just basically had to make the contacts and get that set up. So made it a whole lot more seamless and flexible to move things. Like I said, allowed analysts to bounce around fires easier without concern on, who they had to talk to. And everything was kind of ran through our me or Tim. Able to use virtual or part-time resources. We've used virtual in the past, but there's a lot of times where, like, example, the virtual F-band, that would not be something we would even conceive because, ultimately having people on the ground is probably the best, but when you don't have those, this was something that really worked. We had a SOPL who was on injured reserve. He couldn't leave his district, and he worked probably 6 weeks and did a lot of work. That had that person not had that opportunity. So we were able to utilize people who were duty officers, couldn't leave the district, but evenings had plenty of open time. They were SOPLs, they were LTAMs, those kind of things. A lot of trainees and things like that. People had families. We were able to, that was another thing. People had family commitments, and we were still able to use them and all that. We were flexible, so we had to do a lot of dealing with folks. And it wasn't just like, hey, I need you for 14 days. It was like, hey, we need your help. What can you, what kind of time frame do you have? What can you help us with? And then we kind of, like say, again, lack of a better term, parlayed what we could use. Where in the past it would have been, I need you for 14. Oh, you can't come? Sorry. We were able to utilize a number of trainees. We were able to get them baseline work. We had qualified folks, some really solid folks out there that were working, Casey Teskey, Kim Soper, and we were able to feed them trainees, and they were able to utilize them. And it's a different world to try to utilize either people virtually or whatnot, but in a number of cases, get them additional assignments through the National DSC on site, and we got them signed off. So that was kind of a win-win in being able to use those training resources. When it made sense, the idea was we had the resources, we would work with the GAC. So the first thing was like, hey, North Ops, here's what I have. But here's the strings. Here's how it works. But I will work with you and give you a heads up. If we'd have got into any kind of more power plays as far as priorities, then that's where we would have bumped that up to the NMAC group. But as it worked out, we were able to work with each of the GAC leads or whoever we work with at the time and give them enough heads up that we could move people and not affect our operations. In some cases, if it made more sense, depending if it was for a team assignment, I just had a resource and said, here, rather than me try to manage it, take them and put them into your mix. So there was a lot of different things we did. Created tools and resources for future use. Like I say, the FireNet Teams thing was a big one. And I think that's something that will be useful in the future. One-stop shop for all the tables and the setup and the instruction manuals and how do you set this whole thing up. Allowed for interagency sharing. We were able to pull in ADs. People got access. Or there was some restrictions depending on whether we were a guest or a FireNet owner, but it worked pretty good. Some of the cons, tracking days off. From my perspective, that was tricky because we were utilizing pieces of people's time. And so after a little bit, then it was like, we had calls, set those calls up and said, you need to track this and work with me. And we had some spreadsheets we were trying to work with, but again, that didn't always work when you're using the pieces of someone's time. Getting buy-in from units or agencies, the virtual will work. That's always been a challenge. It will be a challenge. We had to work with folks. I had to make some deals, call around, get to the right person who was on the team and say, hey, we've got this for you. And sometimes it was kind of like we had to give them the product, show them a product, and then get them involved. Sometimes it was, boy, as soon as we got them in there, I know we had one of our ADs that worked for Dixie on our initial strategic planning and was doing maps, age-old maps and different things for them. So well, that was one of the challenges. And you're always going to run that some. It's like I got to see the person. But in today's age of virtual and COVID and different things, you got to be flexible. The F-band was another one. That was one where I think that was a success. Where in the past you would have never gotten anyone to buy into that. But we showed it would work. We used the right people at the right times, and that was good. Initiation or shutdown. Initially, we got going. It was pretty simple. We were at PL5. There was a need. There was a shortage. Once things were going through, then it's like, well, when do we shut this down? How do we shut it down? What are those parameters? So that's still something that's a work in progress. But we were able to kind of work with the NMAC, work with the GACs, and kind of with a common, hey, this is what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? And they're like, yep, good. So we kind of made those connections as we dialed things down. And in some cases, there were people still in place working. They just weren't. We just didn't have that group. They transitioned to a region or whatnot. Capacity for leads. This, because it was new and resources were short, I was kind of the primary, and Tim was backing me up. We had 2 calls a night from July 24th until October 5th, every night. We had an analyst call to kind of go over what was going on, needs, that kind of thing. And then we had a GAC call where we got on those calls and we said, give us, what are your needs? Who do you have available? And then any special considerations. But so that was, it's a workload for about 2 months to be on calls every night. And, it's no different than, I guess, NMAC, but there was only the 2 of us. We didn't have a lot of backup at the time just because of scarce resources. So need to build capacity for others to manage. And that's something that I think we bring this up. There are plenty of people out there more than capable. It's just getting them engaged. Team products, what will get utilized, who will update it. So there's some things that need to be kept track of. And, like anything, you can build it, but if they don't use it or it sits for a year, and it makes it tough. I know when the Northern Rockies had their DSC in 17, when I got there this year, it's like, hey, where's this thing? Where's this AGL product? Where's this document? Where's this spreadsheet? And so we had to go through finding that stuff. So, and then making sure it was up to date and who had permission. So in this environment, you almost need somebody to caretake for each GAC. So we'll see how that goes. And then lastly, just gathering reviews from the field and usefulness. I'm not sure that the majority of the folks even knew we existed. There's no protocol for what we did. I mean, there's standards for teams, smoke jumpers. People realize those are, the national resources and the shortages. I'm not sure people really knew that we were in the background orchestrating and how they were getting this help and where these people were showing up from. So I've been trying to gather information, administrators or MT. So if anyone on the call happens to know someone who did utilize National DSC and was, happy or had some feedback, good, bad, or different, let me have it. So with that, we'll go into just some stats. So like I said, National Decision Support was started July 21st and operated until September 22nd. We started the calls on the 24th. DSC, F-band supported incidents and GACs with fire behavior briefing, field advisory, and other support. I think there was 30 incidents. And again, this is a little bit of a combination of Northern Rockies because we didn't have time to separate everything out. DSC LTANs or THSPs supported 109 incidents with fire behavior modeling, 139 total incidents, received 2,599 model runs. I might add an extra number in there. Excuse me there. Let's see. SOPLs, like I say, supported 30 incidents. I think I said that in the first one. That was F-bands. supported 30 incidents with decision support. And we were helping with timelines, age-old products, it's just kind of like, what do you need? And so they were pretty open to those things. And once we did some of those timelines, those went over really big for people because they didn't have time to do them with the resources being out on the ground. Supported a number of different GACs. Eastern area, we supported fires in Minnesota, then in fact in Canada. The Northwest, we worked with a number of folks here on their fires, North Ops. And then we had to get the DSC set up in North Ops, and they were also helping South Ops. Rocky Mountain, we had a little bit, Great Basin. The one that's missing in there is Northern Rockies. We actually were helping with some things there. It looks like I've got just a couple minutes left. A total of 82 personnel rotated through the DSC. 30 or more of those were individuals with two or more assignments. Some of them more than that, because they were able to do their home job or take care of their families and do this work. 26 personnel were on site, 50 were virtual full-time, 6 were virtual part-time. North Ops, DSC, that was created and supported by the National Decision Support. We were able to peel some people off and say, here, go set this up. Alan Hepworth was a big part of that. So, and I guess questions are at the end. So that's what I have.
All right. Thanks, Mark. And thanks again to Rick and Ben for their presentation. If you've got questions for any of our presenters so far, go ahead and type them into the chat or jot them down, and we'll address them in the Q&A at the end.